July 1456, Belgrade. 100,000 Ottoman troops, 300 heavy siege guns, 200 warships blockaded the Danube River. Leading them was Mehmed II, the man who just 3 years earlier had wiped the Byzantine Empire off the map by breaching the walls that had stood unconquered for 1,100 years. Across the lines, a desperate holding force of barely 7,000 exhausted men, predominantly music Serbs, joined by 40,000 illiterate peasants who had never held a sword. Their weapons were hoes, harrows, and machetes. By every military standard, this should have ended in a massacre within 24 hours. Yet, less than 2 weeks later, Mehmed II himself, the Sultan, who had never lost a siege, was wounded in the thigh and forced to retreat in humiliation. He left behind a camp strewn with corpses, while the greatest war machine of the 15th century lay shattered before an unorganized mob. The Ottoman advance into Western Europe was halted for the next 70 years. This was no miracle. It was the story of one foolish mistake that struck the fatal weak point of the most formidable war machine of its age. Today we're diving into the Siege of Belgrade in 1456. Let's find out how that seemingly invincible war machine was torn apart. To understand why a music fortress on the banks of the Danube could determine the fate of an entire continent, we have to go back 2 years earlier. On May 29, 1453, after 53 days under siege, the Ottoman army under Mehmed II accomplished what the Arabs, the Bulgars, and countless other empires had tried and failed to achieve for more than 800 years. They breached the legendary triple walls of Constantinople. The last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI, was killed defending the city gates. The Eastern Roman Empire, a political entity that had endured continuously since the reign of Constantine the Great, officially came to an end after nearly 1,100 years. The news swept across Europe like a seismic shock. The Pope, kings, and feudal lords all came to the same chilling realization. Even the walls once considered the most impregnable in the world had fallen. If Constantinople, with defenses built and reinforced over centuries, could fall, then no Christian stronghold could be considered truly safe. After that victory, Mehmed II did not stop to rest or consolidate his newly conquered lands. He turned his gaze westward. And on the geopolitical map of the Balkans, only one strategic bottleneck still stood between the Ottoman army and the heart of Europe: Belgrade. Belgrade's strategic importance was no accident. It was shaped by geography itself. The city stood at the confluence of the Sava and Danube rivers, the two vital waterways of Central Europe. It was the natural gateway linking the Ottoman-controlled Balkans with the Kingdom of Hungary. And beyond that lay the whole of Central and Western Europe, including Austria, Germany, and the Italian states. In other words, Belgrade was far more than just another fortress in a defensive network. It was the final bolt on the gate. Once that bolt gave way, there would be no natural barriers or defensive lines left capable of stopping the Ottomans from pouring straight into the heart of Europe. From Belgrade, the road to Buda, the Hungarian capital, would have been little more than a military march. And from Buda, the gates to Vienna and the lands of the Holy Roman Empire would stand wide open. Mehmed II understood this better than anyone. Before launching the campaign, he is said to have declared with the confidence of a man who had just changed history, "I shall dine in Belgrade at noon and in Buda by nightfall." It was no empty boast. It was the logical conclusion of a commander who had never known defeat looking at a weakening fortress defended by only a handful of men while commanding one of the most powerful siege armies of the 15th century. Meanwhile, Europe's response painted an entirely different picture: division and indifference. Pope Sixtus III called for a new crusade to save Belgrade, but his appeal fell on deaf ears. The kings of France and England were preoccupied with their own internal conflicts. The Holy Roman Empire was fractured by power struggles among its princes. Not a single major regular army from Western Europe was sent. In reality, Belgrade had been all but abandoned, left with only 2 men and an almost irrational determination to believe the city could still be saved. No glittering army of armored knights marched into Belgrade to lift the siege, as people often imagine when they think of the Crusades. Instead, the fate of an entire continent rested on the shoulders of 2 men whose backgrounds, personalities, and methods could not have been more different. The first was John Hunyadi, a Transian lord born into the lesser nobility rather than royalty. He rose through his own ability to become regent and the de facto music commander-in-chief of the Kingdom of Hungary. Unlike many European nobles of his age who still believed in the old code music, of knightly warfare, frontal charges, and personal honor above tactical discipline, Hunyadi was one of the few Christian commanders, music, who truly understood how the Ottoman military operated. He had fought them for decades, experiencing both victory and bitter defeat. And from those campaigns, he developed an entirely pragmatic music philosophy of war. Victory came not from glorious acts of courage, but from logistics, fortifications, discipline, and exploiting every inch of favorable music terrain. The second man was almost his complete opposite. Giovanni di Capistrano, a 70-year-old Franciscan friar, thin, austere, and often barefoot. He was famous throughout Europe for his fiery religious preaching. Music, while Europe's nobility turned their backs on the call to save Siege of Belgrade, largely because they feared Ottoman power and refused to risk their professional armies. Capistrano did what no nobleman was willing to do. He walked from village to village, stood before impoverished peasants, and through the sheer fire of his sermons rallied an enormous volunteer army estimated at around 40,000 music people. And here's what made them remarkable. They were not warriors. They were farmers, blacksmiths, and shepherds. Most were illiterate and had never held a real military weapon music in their lives. Their weapons were whatever they used in everyday life. Hoes, harrows, clubs, machetes, music, and on occasion, crude homemade crossbows incapable of piercing professional armor. But they possessed something no professional army could match. Overwhelming numbers and an almost fanatical religious faith ignited by Capistrano music himself. Together, these two men formed an alliance filled with contradictions. Music Hunyadi, with his cold and pragmatic music military mindset, had little respect for this undisciplined peasant horde. He knew that on an open battlefield, an untrained mob with no formation would become little more than easy targets for Ottoman artillery and cavalry. Capistrano, on the other hand, a man shaped by faith and preaching, understood almost nothing about military tactics, defensive deployments, or when to attack and when to music retreat. They were not an army built according to any grand design. They were an alliance hastily stitched together by desperation when no other option remained. Yet music, that unlikely combination, the cold calculation of a veteran commander music, and the irrational zeal of an elderly friar turned out to be something no military music treatise of the age could ever have anticipated. When the Ottoman army arrived and laid siege to Belgrade in early July 1456, the contrast between the two armies became more striking than ever. Not merely in numbers, but in the way they were organized. The Ottoman army was the closest thing the 15th century had ever seen to an industrialized war machine. Their artillery was not only massive, but highly sophisticated, including gigantic siege music guns cast by master gunsmiths that could hurl stone projectiles weighing hundreds of pounds. Powerful enough to reduce almost any medieval wall to rubble after only a few days of relentless bombardment. Supporting them was a corps of military music engineers specializing in tunneling beneath fortress walls to undermine their foundations. An advanced siege technique that very few European powers of the music time could hope to match. On the Danube, the Ottoman fleet formed a blockade designed to cut off every route for supplies and reinforcements music from reaching the city. Yet the most terrifying part of the Ottoman army was not its weapons. It was its men, the Janissaries. They were an elite infantry corps, recruited as boys and trained from childhood, living under a system of near absolute discipline and owing their loyalty to no one but the Sultan. They fought with a level of coordination music that was astonishing by the standards of medieval warfare. They were not music knights fighting for personal glory. They were a war machine operating as a single unified force. Standing against music, that colossal war machine before the unlikely relief force led by Hunyadi and Capistrano could arrive, Belgrade Music Fortress was defended by little more than a forgotten garrison. Under the command of Mihaly Szilagyi, only around 5,000 to 7,000 local music defenders, most of them Serbs, held the walls. They became the first line of defense, the first men forced to absorb the full fury of the Ottoman music assault. 4 days on end, this tiny force endured a relentless bombardment as enormous stone cannonballs smashed into the walls, shedding blood to buy precious time and struggling to keep Europe's last great gateway from collapsing before reinforcements could arrive. When Hunyadi finally reached Belgrade, the contrast with the Ottoman Empire's sophisticated war machine could not have been more striking. Inside and around the battered fortress, a completely different reality was unfolding. With the eye of a seasoned commander, Hunyadi made a defensive decision that bordered on ruthless. He stationed his small force of professional mercenaries inside the main fortress, where disciplined combat and coordinated defense were absolutely essential. As for Capistrano's massive peasant host, he positioned them outside the walls along the riverbank, separated from the regular troops. The decision was not driven by personal contempt, but by cold tactical calculation. Hunyadi feared that if this untrained crowd became mixed into the main defensive line, their panic, uncontrolled retreats, and complete lack of battlefield discipline could shatter an already fragile defense. He needed them far enough away to do no damage, yet close enough to serve as a reserve force if the need arose. That was the true nature of the battle about to unfold. Not simply a confrontation between two armies, but a collision between two completely different philosophies of war. On one side, the industrial precision of an empire at the height of its power. On the other, the raw chaos of people with nothing left to lose. Before the bloodiest fighting erupted on land, another battle was fought on the water. One that would almost determine whether Belgrade had any chance of survival. Mehmed II understood the fundamental principle behind every siege. No fortress, no matter how strong, could survive if it was completely cut off from food, weapons, music, and reinforcements. So he deployed his fleet across the Danube, linking the ships together with massive iron chains to create a floating wall that sealed off the river. It was a carefully calculated naval blockade designed to slowly strangle Belgrade without sacrificing another soldier in costly frontal assaults. If the blockade held, Belgrade would fall not because it had been defeated in battle, but simply because it would run out of food and ammunition, a slow, inevitable death. Fully aware of this existential threat, Hunyadi decided to act before it was too late. He assembled a small fleet, hopelessly outmatched by the Ottoman navy, but compensated with surprise and almost desperate audacity. Supporting those small vessels were the very peasants camped along the riverbanks. Men who, despite having no experience in naval warfare, hurled themselves into battle with reckless, unpredictable zeal. The clash on the river was fierce and chaotic. Hunyadi's small vessels charged straight into the chain barrier, trying to break the links that held the Ottoman ships together. It was not a large-scale naval engagement, but a daring raid aimed at the weakest point of the blockade. The iron chain was broken. The Ottoman blockade fleet was breached, forcing its ships to withdraw or scatter. Although this victory was not as decisive militarily as the land battles that followed, it was of vital logistical importance. It opened a brief corridor through which Hunyadi could bring more soldiers, food and weapons into the besieged city. That decision to break the river blockade bought Belgrade several precious days. Days without which the city might well have fallen before the decisive battle on land could even begin. Phase 1. The General Assault. July 21st. After days of relentless bombardment, Belgrade's already weakened walls began to crumble beneath the devastating fire of the massive Ottoman siege guns. On July 21st, 1456, Mehmed II ordered a full-scale assault. The Janissaries surged through the breached walls and pushed deep into the city. What followed was no longer an organized battle fought in neat formations across an open field, but a savage close-order struggle fought in every street and at every corner. There was no room left for artillery to matter and no formations left to preserve discipline. Soldiers on both sides fought with daggers, burning torches, and even their bare hands in the narrow, suffocating alleys of the ruined city. In this desperate moment, Hunyadi revealed the ruthless side of his command. Seeing Ottoman reinforcements continuing to cross the moat and pour through the breaches to support the troops already inside the city, he ordered his men to throw oil-soaked timber into the moat and set it ablaze. The flames erupted with terrifying force, turning the moat, designed as a defensive obstacle, into a deadly trap. They burned the advancing Ottoman reinforcements and severed the route into the city. It was a cold-blooded tactical decision, one that left no room for moral hesitation, but it worked. The Ottoman reinforcements were cut off, leaving the soldiers already inside the city isolated and forced to fight alone, surrounded by the defenders. Phase 2, the moment of indiscipline that changed the battle. July the 22nd. After a day of brutal fighting, Hunyadi issued a clear and absolute order. No one was to leave the defensive positions inside or around the fortress to launch an unauthorized attack. From a military standpoint, the order made perfect sense. His defenders were too few to risk spontaneous, uncoordinated counterattacks that could collapse the entire defensive line. But the order was not fully obeyed. A small group, perhaps only a few dozen out of Capistrano's tens of thousands of peasants. A handful of peasant music soldiers crossed the river to gather arrows and abandoned weapons, only to unexpectedly run into Ottoman light cavalry. The Akenesis. The two sides began hurling stones and trading insults across the riverbank. Tempers quickly flared. More and more peasants waded music across the river to join what had begun as nothing more than a spontaneous brawl. It should have been a fatal mistake. A few dozen men with no armor and no professional weapons had thrown themselves against one of the largest and most disciplined armies on earth. By every logical calculation, they should have been annihilated almost instantly. And worse still, they could have opened a fatal gap for an Ottoman counterattack. But what happened next defied every conventional military prediction. The Ottoman army, trained and drilled to fight disciplined music formations according to established tactical doctrine, suddenly found itself bewildered by a crowd that followed no military logic whatsoever. There were no formations to target, no central commander music to eliminate, no recognizable pattern to predict their next move. These peasants were not fighting according to any tactical doctrine. They were simply an unpredictable human wave. In the midst of the chaos, Capistrano, who had initially run after the crowd only to stop his men and lead them back to safety, was completely misunderstood. As he rushed forward, waving his banner and trying to turn his followers back, the crowd mistook his actions for music, a signal to attack. They surged ahead and Capistrano suddenly found himself leading a charge he had never intended music to begin. This became the turning point of the entire battle, highlighting music, not Capistrano's zeal, but Hunyadi's extraordinary battlefield instinct. Instead of reacting like music, most commanders of the age, furious, ordering the undisciplined peasants back and treating the incident as a mistake that had to be corrected, music, immediately. Hunyadi did exactly the opposite. He instantly recognized that this unexpected chaos had opened a priceless tactical opportunity in the Ottoman lines. The Ottomans' attention and much of their defensive strength had been drawn toward the chaotic peasant mob, leaving Mehmed's artillery position almost completely unguarded. Without hesitation, Hunyadi committed his elite cavalry, the most music-precious and limited force he still possessed, in a lightning strike aimed directly at Mehmed II's artillery battery. The result was catastrophic for the Ottoman army. Its artillery battery, the very symbol of the empire's technological superiority and military pride, was caught completely off guard and put music out of action. Mehmed II himself, who had never failed to capture a fortress he besieged, was wounded in the thigh during the fighting. News of his injury shattered the morale of the Ottoman army. A force that had once operated with machine-like precision dissolved, music, into panic and fled from Belgrade. The most formidable war machine in the world had been defeated. Not by a more sophisticated music strategy, but by the very kind of absolute chaos that no military manual could ever prepare an army to face. The victory at Belgrade was celebrated across Europe as nothing music short of a miracle. News that Mehmed II, the conqueror who had brought down the supposedly impregnable Constantinople, had been defeated by an army made up largely of peasants, music spread rapidly, becoming a symbol of hope throughout Western Christendom. For a people who had all but given up hope in the face of the seemingly unstoppable Ottoman advance, it was a powerful reminder that the empire music was not invincible. But this story does not end with a fairy tale ending. Less than a month after that historic victory, both of the battle's central heroes, János Hunyadi and Giovanni da Pastrano, were dead. They were not killed by an enemy's sword or arrow, but by a far more ruthless and invisible enemy, disease. After days of brutal fighting, thousands of bodies, Ottoman soldiers and defenders alike, lay unburied around Belgrade under the sweltering heat of summer. Unsanitary conditions and decomposing corpses created the perfect breeding ground for an epidemic. Both Hunyadi and Capistrano contracted the disease while remaining in the area after the battle, and neither survived. It is a harsh music truth that medieval warfare reminds us of time and again, despite our tendency to romanticize great battles. Music, in most wars of that era, bacteria and disease claimed more lives than swords, spears, and cannons combined. Even the most glorious military victory offered no protection, music, against poor sanitation and the outbreaks that followed in the aftermath of battle. The near-simultaneous deaths of these two central figures only underscore the tragic grandeur of the entire story. The men who had saved Europe from one of the greatest threats in its history did not live long enough to witness music, the full impact of their own victory. To fully appreciate the significance of the victory at Belgrade, we need to place it alongside another battle fought 60 years earlier, the Battle of Nicopolis in 1396. At Nicopolos, a powerful European crusading army, including French and Hungarian knights along with forces from many other kingdoms, assembled with superior numbers and equipment. Yet, it was crushed by the Ottoman army, which at that time was still far less developed than it would become under Mehmed II. Their defeat was not the result of inferior numbers or weapons, but of the arrogance and indiscipline of the European knights themselves. Men who charged recklessly, ignored unified command, and valued personal honor above coordinated tactics, while the Ottomans fought with superior organization and discipline. 60 years later at Belgrade, the roles were almost completely reversed. This time the Ottoman army, renowned for its near-perfect discipline and precision, was defeated by the very thing that had once brought Europe to disaster, the uncontrollable chaos of an undisciplined crowd. How could such a paradoxical reversal happen? The answer lies in a profound truth about war and organization. Chaos can itself become a weapon, but only when it meets the right enemy at the right moment. Mehmed II was both a brilliant military commander and an exceptional military engineer. He could calculate the trajectory of every cannon shot and map every weakness in a fortress's defenses with remarkable precision. He could train an army to operate with the precision of a machine. But there was one variable that no military system, no matter how sophisticated, could ever calculate or predict: the irrational behavior of a crowd with nothing left to lose, acting according to none of the tactical principles their enemy had ever been trained to counter. Equally important, Belgrade's victory was not achieved by spontaneous chaos alone, but by the way a pragmatic commander like Hunyadi responded to it. When his original plan to keep the peasant mob safely separated from the main battle was unexpectedly shattered by their own indiscipline, Hunyadi refused to cling to it. He wasted no time punishing or correcting their mistake. Instead, he immediately recognized the opportunity hidden within the chaos, abandoned the original playbook, and rode that unexpected wave to deliver the decisive blow. To this day, the noon bell still rings in many churches across Europe and beyond, a tradition long associated with the victory at Belgrade. But the meaning of those bells goes far beyond commemorating music, a European military victory nearly 6 centuries ago. They serve as a universal reminder that transcends a single battle. No matter how perfectly a system, a plan, or an organization is designed and calculated, there is always the possibility that one irrational and unpredictable variable will emerge and bring the entire structure crashing down. And sometimes the difference between defeat and a victory that changes the course of history lies in the ability to recognize and exploit that chaotic variable instead of trying to eliminate or control it at any cost. Thank you for watching and listening. If you enjoy historical documentaries like this, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next.